Episode 80, The Battle of Ai. Welcome to the history of the Bible. In the last episode, we talked about the city of Ai and how the first battle that the Israelites had with it ended with the Israelites being routed on the battlefield. However, Joshua would discover that it wasn't because of the Lord breaking his side of the covenant, but that the Israelites, specifically one man, broke their side. After the death of Achan and his family, the Lord told Joshua in chapter 8, verse 1, to not be discouraged nor be afraid, but to take the whole army and go up and attack Ai. It isn't sure, but as far as the Bible goes in telling Joshua to attack Ai, this is the first time. When the Israelites went up to attack the first time, there is no mention of the Lord saying to do so, or him telling Joshua how to conquer the city. Instead, what is recorded is that the spies came back and reported what they found, and they suggested sending only 2,000 to 3,000 men to conquer the city. So that's what Joshua did. He listened to his spies who brought the report. It makes one wonder, was the reason that the Lord never mentioned to Joshua to conquer Ai because the covenant had been broken? Could it have been that the Lord was no longer with them in conquering the land, and that he never intended for the Israelites to attack until the relationship had been restored? None of this is for sure. But what is seen is that once the relationship with the Israelites and the Lord was restored by removing Achan, the instructions on how to conquer the land were given to Joshua. The Lord would tell Joshua how to conquer the city. However, the Lord didn't give him as specific instructions as he had done with Jericho. Instead, the Lord simply said, "Lay an ambush against the city behind it." That was it. Nothing else. The Lord did give Joshua and the Israelites permission to take all the spoil and livestock from the city. Why did the Lord permit them to take the spoil from Ai, but not Jericho? Because Jericho was the first battle that the Israelites had fought in the land of Canaan. The Lord wants the first fruits of the people's work. The first fruits of the harvest, the firstborn animal of any livestock. The Lord wanted the first. The same would be true for the cities that they would conquer. Jericho was the first city, and so all of its spoil was to be an offering to the Lord as the first fruit offering. The rest of the cities were spoils that the Israelites were allowed to have. The Lord only wanted the first. Unfortunately, Achan was not able to realize this when he took the gold, silver, and robe from Jericho, because he was stealing the Lord's offering. Now that Joshua had the instructions and the go-ahead from the Lord, he would prepare for battle against the city of Ai the next morning. One thing to point out before we move on with the battle of Ai is the way that the book of Joshua is written when it comes to the battles. Often in ancient times, when a battle was recorded, the king or military leader was the sole focus of the event. Rather, in the book of Joshua during the battles, the emphasis is not on the leader, but rather it focuses more on the Israelites. All of the Egyptian campaigns from this period of history focus solely on the king and what he did in leading the army to victory. But that isn't the case with Joshua. The reason for this is because it wasn't the man or the leader of the Israelites leading them to victory, but rather the Lord was doing so. Just in the way that Joshua, as a book, is written, is meant to point the reader to realize that the Lord was the one fighting the battles for the people. Now, for the battle, The Lord told Joshua to set up an ambush from behind the city. The backside of the city would be facing south, as the gates for the city faced north. The use of the ambush was not new. It had already been used in multiple battles that the Egyptians and the Assyrians had fought, and it would continue to be used for centuries later. As for the battle against the city of Ai, if it were such a small fortress, why even bother attacking it? Jericho at least made sense in taking it because it allowed the Israelites to get a foothold into the promised land. The reason that Joshua looked to attack Ai was because of its location. Based on archaeological findings, where Ai is believed to be, the city was a northern border fortress for the city-states that lived in the southern Canaan area. What this meant is that Ai was an outpost in the north that could give early warnings of oncoming enemy armies to the city-states that lived in the south. These city-states would include Jerusalem and Shechem. However, once Joshua took the city of Ai, he would have a direct line of sight to conquer southern Canaan. As for the ambush that Joshua would set up against Ai, it says in Joshua 8 verse 3 that Joshua sent 30,000 men out at night to go set up an ambush. When the Bible talks about the amount and a number of soldiers, it can be taken that the amount of men is the number said in the Bible. In this case, it would be 30,000 troops. However, the issue that keeps coming up with the word used for thousand can very easily be translated to mean unit. That would mean that Joshua sent 30 units, not 30,000. With this in mind, the question then comes up, how many men were in a unit? During this time, in the Egyptian military, the army was divided into different units, and each unit was believed to have anywhere from 200 to 250 men. More than likely, the Israelites did something very similar to this military forming, as this is where the Israelites came from. And Egypt was a superpower, and many smaller nations would set up their militaries up in a similar fashion. This is also why the first attack on Ai was so devastating. It says that Joshua sent 3,000 men to attack the city, and that they were routed and 36 men were killed. If the word thousand is used, only about 1% of the men got killed in the battle against Ai. However, if it's 3 units rather than 3,000, then that would only be about 600 to 750 men. With 36 men dying, the percentage is a lot higher. Back to Joshua sending 30 units rather than 30,000 to set themselves up and waiting. That would be about 6,000 to 7,500 men rather than 30,000. It could be, rather than it being 30 units that would all be waiting to ambush the city, scholars believe that it was a total of 30 units that fought in the battle, and that only 5 units were sent into hiding to ambush the city. Joshua 8 verse 12 says, 5,000 men were set up in an ambush between Bethel and Ai to the west of the city. Again, the word here for thousand is the same word that is used for unit. That would mean that rather than 5,000 men, Joshua would have sent 5 units into hiding. And based on how large a military unit was, this would have been about 1,000 to 1,250 men. These 5 units were sent out during the night. Here's to set the scene for the Battle of Ai. The city of Ai itself is smaller, with it believed to only occupy less than 3 acres of land. It was a walled city. This can be assumed from the mention of there being a gate on the north side of the city. The walls themselves are found to be about 12 to 13 feet wide. Joshua would set up his 5 units of troops west of the city, and they would be in a valley that was hidden from view from Ai. The rest of the 25 units of troops that Joshua had would have been on a hill that was north of the city. This hill was the highest point in the region, making it a great location for view of the battlefield. Almost like a command center between the city of Ai and the hill that the Israelites camped at. Between the city of Ai and the hill that the Israelites camped at would be a valley or a ravine, as it says in Joshua 8, verse 11. Here is where Joshua would have camped in preparation for the up and coming battle with the city of Ai. He would not camp with the main force of the Israelites on the hill north of the city, nor would he be with the troops that were set and waiting for the ambush. He would stay the night in the ravine. Now, it isn't clear whether Joshua stayed the night in the ravine by himself or if he had a small detachment of troops with him during the night. Some scholars believe that he held the majority of the troops on the hill to the north, while a small group of men, along with Joshua, went to the city of Ai. This is because Joshua wanted to make it seem like the amount of men that were with him was similar to the amount that originally attacked. Scholars point out that Joshua 8 verse 14 says that the king of Ai saw Joshua in the valley and hurried out of the city with his men and prepared to meet Israel in battle. Other scholars point out that it says in Joshua 8 verse 15 that when the battle began, it says Joshua and all of Israel. If it was all of Israel, this would be the troops that were not sent into waiting west of the city in ambush. These would be the 25 units. So whether Joshua had the majority of the army with him, or it was a small detachment of troops, we know that he stayed the night in the valley between the camp of the Israelites and the city of Ai. Here were the battle plans. Joshua would come to the front of the city like he had done before in the previous battle. They would line up for battle and wait for the king and the army of Ai to come out to meet them outside the city. The army of Ai would attack the Israelites, and Joshua would then pull his army back, pretending to flee like they did last time. This would be in hopes of pulling the army of Ai away from the city. Once the army was pulled away from the city, it was then the responsibility of those who were set in the ambush to come out and attack the city itself, setting it ablaze with fire. Once the city was burning, the men inside the city, the Israelites, would come out and attack the army of Ai from the rear. Joshua and his men would then turn and attack the Ai army from the front, causing them to fight on 2 fronts. During the night, the troops that were meant for the ambush left and positioned themselves in the valley to the west of the city, out of sight from the people within Ai. When the morning came, Joshua got his troops ready for battle. They came up against the city, and as soon as the king of Ai saw Joshua and his army north of the city lined up for battle, he assembled his own army and came out against them. When the 2 armies clashed together, Joshua pretended to be beaten again by the armies of Ai. So all of Israel fled. When this happened, the men of Ai believed that they had beaten the Israelites once again. So they called for every male who could fight to come and pursue the Israelites. When all the men of the city were called together, they began pursuing Joshua and the Israelites. It says in Joshua 8, verse 17, that not a man was left in the city, although they did not know what was waiting for them. In addition to gathering all the men from Ai, the nearby city of Bethel, which is estimated to be about 1 mile in distance from Ai, was called upon to help pursue the Israelites. In their minds, this very well could have been the battle that would destroy the feared Israelites. Therefore, when the armies pursued Joshua, both the cities of Ai and Bethel were left unmanned. As the men from Ai and Bethel pursued the Israelites, the men who were set in ambush received the signal from Joshua. The signal was Joshua stretching out his javelin, pointing it towards the city. When the men in the ambush saw this, they immediately rose from their place of hiding and entered the city. They were able to quickly capture the city and began burning it down. It was only then that the army of Ai realized what was happening. As the smoke from the city went up to the heaven, they lost all power to flee, because the troops that were with Joshua stopped fleeing and turned toward the oncoming Ai troops. Meanwhile, the Israelites that were burning the city came out to the battlefield. This left the army of Ai being attacked from the front and the rear. Joshua 8 verses 22 and 23 says that all the army of Ai was destroyed, that only the king was left alive. Otherwise, not one of the men escaped from the battle of the Ai troops. All the men were pursued and killed in battle. When the battle was finished, that didn't mean that the Israelites were finished. They then went back into the city and killed everyone in it. It says in verse 25 that 12,000 men and women, all the people of Ai, were killed. When the battle was finished, the city of Ai was allowed to have all of its spoil of war to be kept. This meant that all the livestock, material goods, food, and anything worth of value. As a side note, when Joshua raised his javelin and pointed it at the city of Ai, it is believed by many scholars that it wasn't a javelin that was used. Rather, scholars have found that the word that is used for javelin is also the same word that could be used for sword. So scholars have found that based on the context and the weapons that were used during that time period, it was more than likely the common sickle-shaped sword that was inherited from the Egyptian army. This is why in chapter 8 verse 26 that Joshua did not draw back his hand with which he stretched out the javelin until he had devoted all the inhabitants of Ai to destruction. So it should be read that Joshua did not draw back his hand that held the sword until the city was destroyed. When the city had been burned and plundered, it is believed that the city of Bethel was plundered as well. However, there isn't any record of it happening at this point during the campaign in Canaan. Scholars assume this to be the case because the men of Bethel, along with the men of Ai, pursued the Israelites as they were fleeing. Whether Joshua and the Israelites conquered Ai and the city of Bethel together or separately isn't known. But it is known that the city of Bethel would be conquered by Joshua and the Israelites. When all was said and done, and the king of Ai was brought before Joshua, some translations say that Joshua hanged the king on a tree until evening, and then at sunset the body of the king was thrown at the entrance of the gate, and a great heap of stones was piled on top of him. However, other translations say that he was impaled on a stake and left there until evening, and then buried underneath a pile of stones at the gate of the city. Which one was it? It isn't known. However, the impaling of a person was often done as a warning to others. just like Achan for stealing from the plunder during the Battle of Jericho, as well as many Israelite leaders for allowing their clan to have sex with foreign women on the east side of the Jordan River. The city itself, which is believed to have been found today, that is Ai, has been discovered to have been burned by fire. It would stay that way, a destroyed city with a heap of stones that remain to this very day. Now that the cities of Jericho, Bethel, and Ai have been conquered, the Israelites have a perfect location from which they could wage the rest of their campaign against the southern cities of Canaan. So join us next time in episode 81, Mount Ebal. Until next time, remember that you are loved, special, and worthwhile. Thanks for listening to the History of the Bible. Let's get the word out by liking, rating, and following the show. This episode was produced by Nikao Productions. To check out other shows, search for Nikao Productions wherever you listen to podcasts.